Warning: the following audio-video contains descriptions of actual war events, which may be disturbing to some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
It's a real joy for me to be here tonight with you. I was a little girl, just 10 years of age, at a missionary conference back in Boone, Iowa. That night, it was a speaker from Africa. And as he bared his heart, such a love for those people, the meeting closed and they gave an invitation. The invitation was not directed to little children. The invitation was directed to the high schoolers, those of college age, young married people. If they would give their lives and go wherever God asked them to go. And there was no one who noticed a little girl sitting there, the second row from the back. And I felt a hand on my shoulder. And I turned around and there was no one there. And I knew it was my Lord. That night God spoke to me and he said, "Would you go anywhere for me, no matter what it costs?" That to me was the most precious moment. I was so thrilled to think that God would even notice me and to think that he would dare to ask me or trust me to be a missionary. That was many years ago, and after 42 years on the mission field, I could answer him exactly what I said that night. I walked down to the altar. Nobody came to deal with me. But that was all right. My business was with God. And I said, "Lord, I'd go anywhere for you, no matter what it costs." And after these years of understanding something of the cost of being a missionary, I could still look up in that beautiful face and I could still say to him, "Lord Jesus, I'd still go anywhere for you." The compensations are so tremendous. Why anyone would ever be afraid to answer the call to be a missionary, I don't understand. Sometimes God allows very difficult times to come into our lives. But those are just God's way of saying, "I love you," because whom he loves, he chastens, only to bring you closer to him. And so tonight I'd like to share just 4 years out of those 42. I'd just love to have the time to spend hours with you to tell you what God has done not only for me. And really in the last analysis, it's like Dr. Ari Jaffrey, our field chairman, said, you never go any farther in your outreach to people than you go deep with God. And as in the physical world, it's pretty much the same. Each begets after their own kind. But I would like to share these 4 years with you, not because I want your sympathy, not because I need your sympathy. Rather, I think you could envy me, that the Lord was so patient and spent so much time with me. But I want you to know that the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Elijah and Daniel is alive tonight. And he's very well.
There are many of you here tonight that don't even remember World War II. There are those of you that are learning that there was a war, followed by the Korean War, followed by the conflict in Vietnam. But many of you don't even remember those days. And I'm sure that those who do remember could never believe, as I could not have believed, that within just a matter of 2 months after Pearl Harbor, that the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy could have taken Hong Kong, China, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, came down the back door into Singapore through Malaysia, and that within those 2 months, they were making their inroads in the Dutch East Indies. I had been a missionary in New Guinea. I had walked over the trail from the south coast into the interior My first husband was the first missionary that ever went into the heart of the western half of the island. And I waited a year and a half before they gave me permission, and I joined my husband in the interior, crossed 14 mountain ranges. All day the carriers had been hurrying me, and they're good psychologists. They didn't say, hurry up like that. They just turned around and looked at me, and they'd say to one another, look at that thing back there, no legs at all on her. So I started to go the more rapidly. That's exactly what they wanted me to do. And I shall never forget that first day when I came to the top of the mountain range and saw below me the first of the villages among these precious Kapauku people, Stone Age people who had only been discovered just a year or so before. And I remember the carrier saying to me, Ega, Niwe, quickly now, let's go. And I finally got to the top of the mountain, and they were so excited because they realized that we really were human beings just as they were. And they wanted us to hurry and get there, not only because we were novel, being people from the outside world, but because of the fact they realized now that all of the things that my husband had told them about God who loved them and his son Jesus Christ was available to them too. Before they had always said, but if Jesus loved you, he didn't love us because we're just human beings and you're spirit beings. But after I recorded their folklore moving across the mountains, I realized that all of these people believe that the known world is that pocket in the mountains there where they live, that people die and their spirits go over those mountains, and because we came from the other side of the mountain out of the spirit world to them, and no one of the early group who went in there had a wife, none had children, so if they weren't spirits, how did they come into existence in the first place? And that's a natural question for them to, and so they decided they were going to kill some of the Dutch people from the government post, and if the spears went through them, they would know that they were spirit beings if they didn't die, but if they died, then they would know that they were human beings. And a government party was ambushed by a group of our natives, and in self-defense, the police had pulled up their guns and killed 7 of our people, and things were very serious. So it was either they bring women into the interior, or they get more police, or they abandon the post in the interior. And here I was, and these carriers with me knew that we were human beings just like they were. And I came to the top of the mountain that day, and I looked down, and I saw the people coming out of the gardens and rushing up the mountainside to greet me. Half your crowd goes, whoo, the other half says, whoo, so you get whoo, whoo, whoo. And I was so excited, I was running down the mountainside to greet them, and I was waving my hands, and the tears were running down my cheeks, and I said, I'm home, I'm home. And for 43 years, that was home to me. And those were my people. And as I came up there, everybody rushed up to me. Everybody gave me a gift. Everybody gave me the same kind of a gift. It was a roasted sweet potato. I had my arms full. I finally sat down on the side of the mountain. They poured them into my lap and around me. And just then, one of the carriers tapped me on the shoulder. He said, Mama, Kapaga Edupa is coming. The chieftain of this village is coming up. And I saw this older man with a bunch of arrows and his bow in his one hand. He stood up in front of me, and he looked down at me, and then he looked up on the mountainside. My husband was coming down the mountainside. I had these very heavy boots like the field police wear with the cat's claws on them because of the broken bottle limestone. He was wearing the same kind of boots, and I knew what was going through his mind. I had heavy leggings on to protect you from the leeches there. When you get into your camp at night, you took off your leggings, you went over your legs with iodine or matches to get the leeches off. And he was wearing the same kind of leggings. I had on heavy khaki trousers, so did he. I had a heavy khaki shirt with long sleeves, so did he. I had a big rain hat. He had on an Australian Army hat. And he looked down at me and he said, Aki Yagamome, are you a woman or not? I said, yes, I am. He said, and they turned down their lower lip. He said, Bill. "You're not." I said, "Yes, I am." And one of the carriers who was on the trail with us, he came and tapped me on the shoulder. He said, "Mama, let your hair down." And I've let my hair down many a time before the people, literally that is. He said, "And mother of mine, indeed you are a woman. No man ever had hair like that, so it must be a woman." And from that moment on, I walked into their village and into their hearts, and they walked into mine. And I was so thrilled when the day came and I could tell them that God so loved the world in their language. And then the day came when we came back. We had made trips into the outer reaches of this tribe of 60,000 people. And when we walked into camp that night, we heard that Holland had been invaded and Holland had fallen within 5 days. And that day when we had stood and heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed, we knew that it could not be very long before we would also be involved very personally in this war. And we watched as the boats came down the Makassar Straits. Instead of coming into the port of Makassar where all the fortifications were, they came in a place in the south coast on the island, on the beach at Brombong. There wasn't a shot fired there. They just walked in and just took over the place. We heard through the grapevine some of our national workers, some of the natives who were bringing food to us. They would come during the night hours and bring us food. And they said they began to kill indiscriminately people just to terrorize the natives. And then we waited, and we knew that it would not be long before they arrived in the interior. One day I looked up from the garden and I saw Japanese soldiers coming. They were the kind that were off the ships, and they wore the tennis shoes with the great toe separated from the rest of the toes so that they could climb the ropes of the ships. When they came to the first house, Mr. Presswood was sitting outside, and he turned and he put his hands up as anyone would do, a token of surrender. And the moment he put his hands up, they took their bayonets and they began to slash at his arms because they didn't want him to put his hands up. But Mr. Presswood didn't know that. And he was a very tall man, and they despised tall people. I have seen them jump up to slap people on the face that were taller than they were. And then he came over to the house where we were staying. And of course, they said, "Come over and join the rest of them." And they had their bayonets fixed on their gun. And I tell you, that's a great persuader. We hurried. We got there. The one officer slouched down in the chair, threw his leg over the side, and he proceeded to tell us that we were now prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Army, that we were going to be imprisoned right there on the hillside, that if we ever were caught outside of the premises, that we would be shot on sight, that we were to have no contact with any of the natives, that we were to remain there until they came back again and told us what they were going to do with us. Dr. Jaffrey was asked what nationality he was, and of course he was as nervous as the rest of them. He said, "Canada." And the man said, "Where is Canada?" And he did not know where Canada was, so he just dismissed Dr. Jaffrey. It was the Americans that he hated. And then he saw that Mr. Deibler had his hands folded together in front of him, and he said something to one of the soldiers, and he went over and he had his bayonet, but it was inside of the sheath, and he began to pound on my husband's hands. And he would knock them down, and he would put them back up again. And finally, Mr. Presswood spoke up, and he said, "Russell, he wants you just to put your hands down at the side." Of course, it wasn't, he couldn't have told him that. And I watched, and I saw how his hands were beginning to swell. And then they told us that we could go back to the other house, but never, ever were we to leave the premises there. Then they said, "We're leaving you now. We will be back again." The second time they came back was Friday the 13th of March. And of course, all of us immediately began to gather near the door so we could go out and not anger them. When the car pulled up in front of the house, out jumped the soldiers and 2 officers. The one officer came in, and we, of course, greeted him by bowing to him, and he said, turning to me, "Get some clothes for your husband. Not many. We're only going to take them down for a few days to question them." And he said, "No bags." And I ran into this little house, and I grabbed up a pillowcase, and I put in some of his clothes and his Bible, a notebook, and a pen. And then as I came out, one of the officers was motioning for me to come. I ran over to the Jaffrey house. Dr. Jaffrey was in his bedroom with one of the officers. He said, "Now what is wrong with this old man?" And I said, well, and I began to enumerate the things that were wrong with him, because Dr. Jaffrey had been very ill. I said he was in a coma on the coast just before you people came. And I said he has a heart condition. He also has a kidney condition. And I went on to name all of the things that were wrong with him. And he said, well, anybody that needs all the medicine that man needs is not going to last very long anyway, so he'll just stay here. Just tell him he doesn't need to pack. Well, I knew that the only thing Dr. Jaffrey was using was saccharin, and I couldn't understand what all this medicine was that he was packing. And so after they had gone, I went in to see him, and I said, "Dr. Jaffrey, what was all this medicine that he said you were packing there?" He said, I realized that if they took us out of the mountains, they must be going to take us down to the coast." And he perspired profusely. He loved eau de cologne to put on his handkerchief and to mop his face with. That was what he was packing. And that officer thought that it was medicine, but you know, that was God just keeping that man with us. We needed a man there on the property. And I've often thought how God brings to naught all of the machinations of the enemy. And so I ran out after telling the officer all the things that were wrong with him, and I ran out and I saw that Mr. Deibler was already in the truck. And I ran up to it and I handed him the little bundle of clothes and things, and I thought they could have at least waited till I could say goodbye to him. They'd already started up the motors, and he looked down at me and he said, "Honey, just remember one thing, dear, that God said, 'I will never leave thee nor forsake thee.'" And I'll tell you tonight that I really thought there were times when my God had left me and forsaken me. I never saw him again. That day we realized we were there, and that we were going to have to make some kind of gardens. We were going to have to find some way to keep alive. We had, among other things, to contend with rats. One of the things that I have said, if I ever have time, I'm going to write a book on the rat and I could tell you so many stories about rats. I've had rats always in my missionary life, and in the Baliem Valley where we were among the cannibals, and I was adopted by the chieftain as his daughter, we had rats in there that weighed 30 pounds. That's a rat. They were true rodents.
You were speaking about being there at Sentani. We lived in that old army mess, and finally my husband put a wire around our bed, screening around our bed, because even in the afternoon when I put our baby down to sleep, there came those rats, and they hung on that screen, just looking in at us. I've had rats in bed with me, and I won't go into all of that, but we had to protect ourselves against these rats that would get into the house. And of course your houses are just a single wall where the rats could come through most any place. When it gets damp and the wood swells, there are lots of openings for the rats to come in. And during the rainy season, they invited all the country cousins to join them. Rats in that house, even in the daytime. So every evening, before we went to bed, Miss Jaffrey and I was staying in the house with Dr. and Mrs. Jaffrey and their daughter Margaret. And every evening we went through that house, the two of us, armed with a broom, and we would run all the rats that we could find into the kitchen, because it was the only room in the house where we could shut both the doors and shut off their exit. They couldn't get out. And we fought those rats until we killed all the rats we had corralled. And then we would go back and try to find others. And when we felt we had cleaned out all the rats that were in the house, then we would go to bed. And I've wakened in the night, and I can still see those rats running up the wall and then jumping on you. And you'd fight them off and then beat them with the broom until we'd kill them. We were living in the midst of the Boogies people, the bandits, pirates of the islands, as they were known, and they had killed 4 Dutch people, stabbed them to death just down over the mountainside from us. The Japanese apprehended one of the men. He was just completely covered with blood from where he had been fighting the Dutch person that he had killed. And they were very bold people. They looted and plundered other ships. They were feared by the other peoples of the islands. They always wore a black sarong, so you knew a Bugis person. And we were living in the midst of these Bugis people. One night, I was very conscious of noise all through that house. And I finally came, sometimes when you're just half awake and you're conscious of something going on around you and yet you're not fully with it. I finally came fully awake about midnight, and I sat up in bed and shook Margaret, and I said, Margaret, there's just rats all over this house. Let's get up and light the lamp and go out and have another go at them and see if we can get some more of them, because they would even eat the leather of your shoes if you didn't have them in a closet or somewhere out of sight. Your clothes were eaten. And so I went to the door, and when I pulled open the door of the bedroom, it opened into a hall that ran the length of the house, into a living room, dining room affair at that end, into a bathroom, and over the porch on the other end. And when I came to the door and opened it and pulled it open, someone just swished past me in the dim light of a tiny little night light that we had there for Dr. Jaffrey, who often needed to get up in the night. And I thought it was Dr. Jaffrey, and I thought, what a strange way for him to be acting in the middle of the night. What's he rushing off down the hall for? So when I came out, and I could see who it was one of these Bugis people standing there. So he grabbed his sarong, threw it up over his shoulder, and pulled out his machete, the long knife. And why I did what I did, I can't explain it, because I'm really quite a coward. But I started down that hall after him. He was a bigger coward than I was, because he just looked shocked to think this woman was coming after him, and he turned and he ran, and I followed him right through that bathroom, right out of over the porch, down over the mountainside. And when suddenly he was joined by several others coming out of the jungle, I stopped dead and I thought, oh, Lord, what a foolish thing for me to do. And immediately the Lord answered me. He said, my child, the angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him and delivereth. I turned around and I walked back. I tried to get a hold of the doorknob, and I realized that they're very clever with their machetes. They had carved out the nicest porthole you ever saw, removing the doorknob, the lock, the key, and everything that went with it. So I pulled that shut, and by this time the rest of them were awake, and Dr. Jaffrey said, well, what's wrong? And I said, oh, we've had bandits in here, Bugis people. They had even taken panes out of the windows and laid them down. They'd been hours in the house, just looted the place, gone through the books, evidently looking for money. I went up to the storehouse and I got some boards and I nailed the whole door shut. And I covered up that hole, but there were other doors in the house they could have come through. They came back night after night. And we could hear them coming, we could hear them outside, and yet they never came or tried to open any of those doors. It was after the war was over and I finally went back to Indonesia and then back to New Guinea that I was there, and I had often through those years wondered if Nomo, a Bugis boy who came down and used to work in the gardens when they were cleaning around the place when they were building the Dr. Jaffrey's house, if he had been with them, because it was someone who knew the layout of that house. And so I found him at one of our conferences. And I went to see him, and I said, Nomo, were you one of those that came there in the house that night that stole all the curtains and all these other things and went through the books? And he dropped his head and he said, yes, he said, and he said, we came back several nights after that, but you had all those people in white on guard out there. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about those that fear him. And beloved, I'll tell you one thing, if I didn't know that God's angels were round about me, I don't think I ever would have stayed in New Guinea. There have been so many times there in New Guinea when for months at a time we didn't know if we'd be alive the next moment or not. Our house has been surrounded. They have tried on many occasions to kill us, and yet God's angels have kept those people from killing us. I remember the nights when with our two little boys, in just a little aluminum shed with an aluminum roof, we would awaken in the night because the boys were screaming. They had nightmares. They told us later that they had been out there working black art on our children. They have something that's almost like voodooism, where they take a potato to represent you, and then with a little spear made from the shin bone of a bird's leg, they would make this little spear, and they would sit around a big net in the chief witch doctor's house, and they would spear that thing saying, Horasi Watlaga, Horasi Watlaga, Horasi Watlaga, Mr. Rose is dead, Mr. Rose is dead, Mama Horasi Watlaga, Mrs. Rose is dead, Mrs. Rose is dead. And my husband took very ill at that time. And those people knew it, and they sat on either side of the strip that he was making for the plane so that we could have contact with the outside world again. There were many times when 6 and 8 months we'd be totally cut off from the outside world. We had no mail, we had no supplies, and that was no problem. But there were nights when I would hear them there, and their 16-and-a-half-foot spears would hit the aluminum roof of our house, and our children would cry out. And I would go and I'd pull those little boys into bed with me, and I'd say, Lord, I'm so glad to be here, but do I have a right to bring my children into this? Somehow His presence would fill that room, and we would go to sleep and never even knew when they left the place. And in the morning we'd find all these little things that they'd left outside that was used in their black heart. God's angels still protect His own.
This one dear little woman who was a Bugis woman, but I had led her to the Lord before the war. And one day she came running in and she said, Nyonya, I have something special for you people today. And I thought, aha, I know what it is. Because the flying ants were coming out of the holes in the ground by the hundreds. And I had seen the children out running over the mountainside catching these flying ants. And she handed a half a coconut shell to me. When I looked in it, here were little things that looked like little cheese tidbits. Of course, you don't eat the head, you don't eat the wings. You just take off the back part of the body and you drop it in coconut oil, and they were really quite delicious. I said, I have never refused anything that my people have ever given me. Nothing. Caterpillars, my present husband says to me, that must be like swallowing a toothbrush. I said, oh no, you just take a handful. Those big cocoons out of which the men make the headpiece that they have to cover their bald heads, because, you know, you can take a man out of the 20th century, or you can take him out of the Stone Age, and they're all the same. When the forehead begins to travel, and that's our word for getting bald, the forehead begins to travel, and when it gets back here, and it's the past complete tense, serious matter. So Adaglio Witame goes and he gets these big cocoons. He eats the caterpillars first, then he pulls that down over his head. And then he puts pure potter's clay over it and gets the plumes of the cassowary bird and he puts those in. Don't we think we're smart here in America with our good wigs? Why, they've had wigs out there for centuries. And they're not bad, believe me. It's just that it takes so many of those caterpillars to make a meal. But they gave us many strange and weird and wonderful things, and we ate them.
We had started to make a garden. We were trying to plant some things, and one day they came and said, we're going to take you somewhere else. We're going to intern you. You're living in too much luxury. Well, if you know what the houses are like there, you know that was a misstatement. They took us from this place where we had been 5 miles more up into the mountains, and then they pointed across at some little shacks that were on a mountainside. We had to go down into the valley and up to these shacks, and they said, that's where you're going to stay. And they left us there. And then we really had to scrounge for food because our Christians couldn't get into us. I remember this one seed in particular. It had the most beautiful quality. The more water you added to it when you were cooking it, the more it swelled, and our stomachs were full. And we called it birdseed because we would stand out. We had just a little lean-to outside. We cooked over an open wood fire. We would get our firewood out in the jungle. And we would stand there and stir this. And the one song I remember above all else, and I blocked out an awful lot about that time. But I remember standing there singing, "He makes the rose the object of his love. He guides the eagle through the pathless air, and surely he remembers me. My heavenly Father watches over me."
But the things that I remember most about it is seeing the faith of a man like Dr. Jaffrey. You know, it wasn't until I was writing this book that I realized that that flashlight of Dr. Jaffrey's and those batteries that he had lasted for over 2 years, and never once did they go out. There was no way to get new ones. And Dr. Jaffrey needed that flashlight, and I said to him, "How is it that they have never discovered your flashlight?" He said, "When I hear them coming," and we would always sound the alarm. Everybody knew when they were coming. And he said, "I just go up there and I lift up my pillow and I put that and my father's watch under there, and I say, Lord, these things are meaningful to me. I need that flashlight, and this watch they don't need. That was my father's." And I put the pillow back down on there. And you know, watching those soldiers when they would come, they just loot the place, and they would always come to Dr. Jaffrey's bed. They'd grab the mattress at the foot end and throw it up over that pillow, and then they would look for something that might be hidden there, and then they never lifted up the pillow. And Dr. Jaffrey would come in conscious that they were going to be there. He would put down that mattress, he would lift up the pillow, put his watch back up on the little stand beside the bed. I saw the man of faith that he was. Those were very precious experiences to me. And the time when he stood at the end of my bed there, and I had been out working in the garden. I thought it was a sunstroke, and I had a very high fever, and there was no way they could get it down. And I remember Dr. Jaffrey standing at the foot of the bed, and he had his hands on the iron bedstead, and he just looked up without even closing his eyes. He said, "Lord, it's difficult to be sick at any time, but," he said, "especially in this time of war, and when these soldiers come," he said, "would you keep them away as long as Darlene is sick in bed?" And you know, I was in bed for 6 weeks before my fever finally came down, and never once did any soldiers come to that place. And I said that the day I got up and I had dressed for the first time and gone out, the alarm went off and said, "Soldiers are approaching." I said, "Dr. Jaffrey, couldn't you just said 6 months instead of 6 weeks?" After we had been there about 6 months, they came and said, "We're going to take you somewhere else and intern you." We packed up a few things. We were only allowed to take 3 other dresses beside the one we wore, so I put on all the clothes I could get on. I was within 6 months of furlough when the war came, so I knew my clothes wouldn't last very long. And we went from the place where we were staying there across the mountain over to the village of Molino, where the Dutch people had been interned. And that night we slept in a church. We put the older people up on the benches in the church, and we slept down underneath on the floor, waiting for the trucks, and the trucks were beginning to pull in at dark. And then just as it was just getting light in the early morning hours, we heard them start to rev up the trucks, and everybody was beginning to move. And I can remember lying there and thinking, oft methinks I hear his footsteps stealing down the paths of time, and the future dark with shadows brightens with a hope sublime. And I thought, Lord, couldn't you just come back today? And always there was there, even in the darkest of the days, the realization that God was there and things became bright again. I remember that day as we got into those trucks, and they were just stake beds, and there wasn't even a tailgate on there, so the younger one of us joined our arms together so that we could make a cordon around the older people in the center of the truck bed, and there was one up on either side that held on to the cab so that we wouldn't be thrown out, because with all of those people that they loaded into the back of these trucks, they drove just as fast as they could and round the corners, And we were just sure that somebody was going to be thrown off of that truck, or the whole lot of us were going to go down the mountainside. The hundreds of feet below, you could see the valleys down there. But by the time we finally got to the coast, they pulled up into an area that they had been making into an internment camp. We looked and saw these great long barracks. They were about a half block long, and they said, "This is where you're going to be staying." We found our place, and then they immediately said, "No, we want all the foreigners in this one barracks, Barrack 8. And that night, as we came together, all of the foreigners, we began to discuss someone to be the head of our barracks, because we were told we had to choose someone. Why they chose me, I don't know, because I was one of the youngest of the women there. I think it was probably because of my languages. I spoke Dutch fluently, I spoke English, and I also spoke the Indonesian language. And the first night I said, we are going to need the help of God in these months or years that lie ahead of us. And that night I read in their languages, and I prayed that God would protect and keep us and draw us together, and those that did not know him might come to know him as Lord and Savior. We learned later that many of the women from other camps, other barracks, would come over and sit down outside because they felt such a need and a hunger for God. And out of all of those barracks in that camp, Barrack 8 was the one that held together. And it was because of our faith in Jesus Christ. As soon as they would take some of those young boys that had reached the age of 16 to send them up to where the men were, there were Dutch people waiting to come in because they had a heart hunger after God. We had to work for the Japanese. We were their work crew. We had to make uniforms for them. The older women who could not do the heavy work outside were expected to knit white socks for the officers. And so their needles were busy all the time. All the omas, all the grandmothers. If you were cooking porridge, you were up at 4 o'clock in the morning, cooking in a large drum. It had kerosene in it. There was no way we could wash it out and get that taste out until after many, many cookings of rice for porridge in the morning. There was just above the drum in which we cooked the porridge a ledge. One night, something must have happened. We figured out later it must have been that there was a bird roosting up there, and a rat had come to get the bird. And in the struggle, they had fallen into the drum. Well, it was so dark out there you could not see. And so merrily we stirred the porridge, and when it was dished up, everybody said, "That's the best porridge we've ever had. It tastes just like chicken." But when the light of day came and we could look down into that, here were feathers, the tail of a rat, carcasses. Some of them gave their porridge back to Mother Nature, and I decided I'd hang on to it. And I tell you, it wasn't bad. I can tell you this, that a rat is cleaner than a duck, because most of them eat seeds. Anyway, we had to, those of us who were young, we took the work, the heavy work. We had, among other things that we raised for them, pigs. We had a large pig pen that had a beautiful cement floor that had to be kept clean. We had to cook 3 meals a day for those pigs. The camp commander went out into the jungle, or out into the villages near us. He shot dogs, brought them in. We skinned the dogs, cut them up, cooked them with the stems of the banana plants so that these pigs could have 3 hot meals a day. When the garbage came in from the coast, from the officers there, we always gave it the finger test. You went through it like this, and if it didn't fall between your fingers, it was big enough to eat. And we ate the dog's livers. When he found out that we were eating the livers from the dogs, it doesn't taste any different from calf's liver. We were told that if he ever caught any of us eating the dog's liver, that he was going to beat us up. We knew that he could because he had just killed one of the men up in the men's camp before he was brought down to our camp. And so we were very careful that we weren't caught getting the dog's livers. Some of the other things we carried back, hid them inside of our clothes so we could carry them back and have them for the kitchen for those that were in the hospital and those that were very ill. With the pigs, we got flies, and with the coming of the flies by the aliens into the camp, we had to kill, in spite of all of the other work we had to do, we had to kill flies, and you were sometimes called up to his office, and he made you count the flies, lay them out so that he could see that everybody had 100 flies a day. And in spite of that, there still were just aliens of flies. We got dysentery in the camp, and of course the flies carried the dysentery everywhere. You couldn't sit down and eat your food without having flies in it, and you kept going like this all the time you were eating. They brought in, sometimes we had sufficient food, sometimes we didn't. We said we never skipped any meals, but we sure postponed a lot of them. But when they brought in these fish, boy, we didn't take anything off of them, and we didn't take anything out of them. And I can remember Mrs. Presswood sitting next to me, and she said, "You know, darling, I could eat the head of that fish if it didn't look up at me so pitifully." I said, "I long since lost my pity for here," and I gave her a piece of the tail of mine, and she would give me the head of hers. The only thing you can't eat about a fish is the pupil of the eye. It gets to be just like a hard little BB.
Then we had to build roads for them. Out there in the sun, working with those great heavy hoes and building roads for them. We had to work in their coolie gang. We unloaded their trucks for them. I can remember standing on the pier down in Macassar watching the coolies come to unload the ships. And I saw that they always rolled their shoulders over and waited until that hit their shoulders, and they grabbed the ears of those big sacks. And I learned to do that. I wore a brace for several years after the war because of the injury to my spine. But you walked off with those loads or else. We also raised chickens. We had to gather up all the manure from the chickens. We had big pestles and mortars that we used. We put the chicken manure down in there, and then we'd stand with those big 6-foot pestles pounding that, and it had to be as fine as sand. Then we had to sieve it so that there would be no little lumps in there, and that was sent down for the rose gardens of the Japanese. We had to make gardens for them. We worked in the rice fields, sometimes almost up to our hips in mud that was filthy from pigs and from water buffalo. We developed the big tropical ulcers eating into our skin. We didn't have any medicine, so we would save soap suds, and we would put our bandages in the soap suds and then put them around our legs. You never threw away a bandage. You always washed it out. And so it became a mosaic of blood and pus and dirt.
But we had so many people down with dysentery that finally there were 500 people down with dysentery that could not get out of bed any longer. They made a barracks for them. We took them out there. And those that were in the last stages of dysentery, guards were set around those beds to keep the rats off of them because they smelled death. So we had a third of our camp down. We began to pick up more and more jobs for the older ones and those that were sick, so that we would fill out the quota of work that was demanded of us. I remember a day when the priest came down from the men's camp, and with him was a new second in command. And he was a little fellow. I don't suppose that boy was much more than 15 or 16 years of age. And he had such a sweet face, we promptly named him Sweet 17. And that young man asked immediately who I was. And he would come over and he would shake hands with me. And he would find me 2 or 3 times a day, and he would come and he would bow to me. And then, because he knew it was our custom, he would shake hands with me. And he would greet me, and finally he scared me. I didn't know why he was coming to me in particular. So I asked the other women, please, to watch, and when they saw him coming, just to let me know so that I could get out of the way. But somehow he always seemed to find me. All he did was greet me. And the Catholic priest was there, and everybody was trying to get a chance to talk to him. He had been brought down to butcher those pigs so that they could be sent down, already slaughtered, to the coast, to Makassar. I thought many times, I'm going over and I'm going to ask him about Russell.
I had not had any word from my husband except for 2 letters that were delivered up in the mountains. All the time I had been there, I never had a word from him, didn't know where he was. And yet God kept me in perfect peace. This one morning, Mrs. Jouster, who was the Dutch lady who was head of our camp under the Japanese camp commander, came over to the barracks and she said, Frau Deibler, I would like to speak to you for a moment. So we walked out and we talked about the work and how those of us who were young, and I had a number of strong young women in my camp, and I said those of us who are young can help to fill up the gap left by those that are down with dysentery. And we talked about the work problem, and finally she stopped and she looked at me and she said, but Mrs. Deibler, I didn't come to talk to you about the work. I came to tell you that your husband up in the camp in Pari Pari, which was about 100 kilometers to the north of us, has been very ill. And then I saw the tears in her eyes, and when I saw them, I grabbed her shoulders. I said, oh, Mrs. Jouster, you don't mean he's gone?
She said, yes. Some 3 months ago, he died in the camp in Pari Pari. I was like every young person. I loved him. I was waiting for the day when the war would be over and we could go back to our people in New Guinea. It was just like all my hopes were shattered and gone. And I just turned from her and I started to walk away. And I said, God. And immediately he answered me. He said, my child, did I not say to you that when thou passest through the waters, I would be with you? And through the floods, they not overflow you? He said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I said, Lord, there's so much sorrow in this camp. I'm just asking one thing of you. Help me not to make my sorrow other people's sorrow. I said, just help me to dry my tears. Oh, the nights when I lay on that rack up there, the tears would flow. I learned in those days that there's a peace that cometh after sorrow, of hope surrendered, not of hope fulfilled, a peace that looketh not upon tomorrow, but calmly on a tempest that is stilled. It's a peace that lives not now in joy's excesses, nor in the happy life of love secure, but in the unerring strength the heart possesses, from conflicts won while learning to endure. It's a peace that is in sacrifice secluded, a life subdued, from will and passion free. 'Tis not the peace that over Eden brooded, but that which triumphed in Gethsemane. And I can tell you tonight, beloved, there is a peace through the comfort of the Holy Spirit that nobody can understand until you've passed through it and know. God never allows anything in your life but what is for your good and His glory. Just remember that, won't you?
I learned to know what the comfort of the Holy Spirit is. It's real. I had to walk down the corridor of time many years before he could tell me why Russell was taken. I could thank him for it. The doctor finally came to the camp after the war was over, and he said if it hadn't been for that terrible condition of his heart, I think I could have brought him through. He said his heart was so bad that if he had lived, he had been an invalid the rest of his life. And I could think what a terrible thing that would have been for Russell, who had been nothing but a pioneer missionary all his years there. He opened up the work up in Borneo, where in less than 10 years God gave us more than 10,000 believers among our diaspora headhunters. And then he opened up the work in New Guinea, where today there's an indigenous church that stretches from one side of the island to the other, where we've gone.
I can remember the days when, if you just mentioned the shock troops, it sent terrible fear into your heart. But then there came a time when we learned to fear another group much more than the shock troops. They were called the Kempetai, the secret police of the Japanese. Some of our women were taken away. Some of them never returned, but those that did return never talked about what happened to them. And then I remember the day when that big black limousine, we called it the death wagon, it came up and it stopped in front of the headquarters. And they called for Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley, the only two other Americans in that camp. There was an American woman who came from another island. But we were the ones, the only three that were Americans that spoke the Indonesian language and were known by the people there. And that day when they took Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley away, we all turned around and looked at one another. And we asked, why were they taking them? And we waited, and we prayed, and they did not return. 1 week went by, 2 weeks went by. And then one day the whisper went through the whole camp, as it always did, Kempetai, Kempetai. The secret police are coming. And that day as I ran out front so I could see Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley were getting out of the car. And when I saw that there were soldiers and officers getting out of that car and running up into the headquarters office, I knew in my heart they had come for me. And so I started over toward the office because I did not want to keep them waiting. And just then, Sweet 17 came down out of the office. And he said, yes, they're coming for you. Come quickly. When I walked up into the office, they were walking around me and laughing. There was only one word that I understood, and that was America. Languages have come easily to me. I spoke 7 languages, and I did not understand what they were saying. I had certain commands I had to give in Japanese, and I just closed my ears to it, because it was better for you not to know the language. And when those men walked around laughing, America, one of them stopped and he put down something in front of me. And I looked down at that piece of paper and I saw my name written on it, Darlene Deibler. He said, you are Darlene Deibler Rose. I said, yes, sir, I am Darlene Deibler, but I didn't write that. He said, I didn't ask if you wrote it. But he said, what do you know about Morse code? And he began to tap out messages on that desk to me. I didn't know Morse code. I didn't know what he was tapping out. So I didn't respond. I said, sir, I do not know Morse code. He said, go over and get another dress. Come back. He said, we're going to take you somewhere else to intern you. I ran over and I grabbed a dress which had a full circular skirt. Why I had put that dress on that day, I don't know. But I had another one. And so I grabbed that and I grabbed my Bible off of the top rack where I'd been sleeping. And then I ran back so that I could get into the car. They ushered me in with 2 soldiers, one on either side. They had their bayonets fixed on the gun. And the 2 officers were up front with the chauffeur. When we came down to the city of Makassar, I recognized the building into which they were going to go into the driveway. And I saw that they had made a jail out of it. And there, just in front of me, as we pulled up, I saw Miss Kemp, a woman who had weighed about 170 pounds, and in just 2 weeks, that woman looked like she was skin and bone. She was hanging onto the bars and shaking her head at me, and I saw her arms were all black and blue. And when I stepped out of that car, I just cried out to the Lord, Lord, you took Russell, must I now go through this? And so sweetly my Lord answered me. He said, my child, whom I love, they are the ones that I chasten, I discipline. I said, all right, Lord, but please help me to be a good soldier. And those were the last words that Dr. Jaffrey ever said to me when he was being taken away from our camp. I ran up to the back of the truck, and he was being taken to the men's camp, and I looked up at him and I said, goodbye, Dr. Jaffrey. And he leaned down and he put his hand over mine and patted it. He said, Lassie, whatever you do, be a good soldier for Jesus Christ. And I said, Lord, I don't know what's going to happen to me here, but please make me to be a good soldier. I said, if ever I come out of this place, and if any of my fellow Americans ever hear about what happened to me here, I don't want them to be ashamed of me. The first thing they grabbed away was my Bible. They said, you don't need that, and you are not going to have it. You just sit in that cell and you would read that book and not think about your evil deeds against the Imperial Japanese Army. They grabbed the other dress, and I handed it then as they were trying to grab it. And I said to the girl there behind the desk, I said, would you see that Miss Kemp gets this? Because she hadn't even had time to get a dress or anything except for the work suit that she was wearing.
And then the guard came and he put his bayonet on the gun and he shoved me around out of the door, and I went through that first cell block.
And when you feel the prick of that bayonet, you move. And I was moving to try to keep ahead of it. Went across a courtyard, and then there was another big cell block there. And I saw the guard point this way, and I turned and I went along that cell block. He came to a cell that had been completely boarded up, window, so that no one could see who was in that one. And then he stopped at that one. And I looked up and I read on the door, Orang ini musti mati, this person must die. And I knew I was in death row. I could hear Miss Seeley, and I knew that within 2 weeks, that woman was a raving maniac. And when he opened the door and shoved me and I hit the other wall and I turned around and I came back and I dropped on my knees in front of the door because I wanted to watch that key. I knew when it made a complete revolution, I was locked in death row. As I sat there and I saw that man pull the key out, start to walk away, I suddenly realized I was sitting on the floor and I was singing. Do you know what I was singing? A song I learned as a little girl in Sunday school. Fear not, little flock, whatever your lot. He enters all rooms, the doors being shut. He never forsakes, he never is gone. So count on his presence from darkness till dawn. And I knew that they could not lock my Lord out of that cell, even when they locked me in. I don't know if you'll understand it, but that little cell became a sanctuary to me because my God was there with me. That afternoon, they threw a plate of rice across the floor to me. It was in a tin plate with no spoon, nothing to eat it with, but I'd learned well from the Indonesians. I knew how to get a bit of rice and roll it into a ball, stick it down there, and with your thumb you go like that right into your mouth. but I couldn't eat. When he picked it up, he said, "So, you don't like sugar?" And there was a little bit of sugar in the top of it. He said, "You'll never get it again." And no, I didn't. And they left me there in that cell about 48 hours without allowing me to go out and relieve myself. I prayed and I suffered. I knew that if I did anything on the floor of that cell, that I might be like some of the others, have to eat it up off the floor. It wasn't until the next day in the late afternoon they finally took me out to where there was a toilet. And I looked at the door, it was shut, but I could see fecal matter oozing out from under that door. And when I reached to open the door, it just gushed out. And I said, "Lord, I have all these ulcers on my leg, and if I step into that, it'll be almost to my knees." And I saw a young man run up to the officer who was watching me to see what I would do. And the young man said, "I will get water for you, sir. I will wash that down for you." And he just nodded to him in that way. And so he ran. I can't tell you how many buckets of water that young man carried. And I know that he knew who I was, till he finally had it cleaned out. And then I was taken back. And they realized that I had dysentery. I had had dysentery, I knew that, but somebody had to pick up the extra work. And those of us who were still on our feet, we tried to do the other things that our sick people could not do. When they found out that I had dysentery, they didn't bring me any rice, the dry rice. I saw the first day when he tossed that across the floor to me, and the only opening or light came through the little transom above the door. And I reached down and I thought in the dim light in the cell, that beautiful white stuff on the top. Oh, and I clapped my hands and I said, "Lord, there's somebody out there that knows I just love grated coconut." But then when I picked it up and the light from the transom fell on it, I realized it wasn't coconut. It was full of worms. I started to push the worms up onto the side of the plate, but because there was nothing but an open tin that they had brought into my cell, and I had dysentery, and hundreds of these big blue bottle flies were in the cell with me all the time. And they left the bucket there, and they came, and they were sitting on my rice, and they were eating those worms. And I was trying to get rid of them, and I kept going like that, but you can't handle rice porridge, and it was just rice that had not been washed. It was dirty. There was no salt in it because I also had beriberi, which is a form of dropsy, and my legs were swelling. And they knew that I had the dysentery, so that's why they put me on rice porridge. And as I was pushing those worms up on there, I decided if those flies can eat that, so can I. And I never took another worm out of there. And I could bow my head and thank God that I had that bit of rice porridge and perhaps a bit of protein as well. And I would eat it and say, "Thank you, Lord. I could be here without anything." Yes, I went to the hearings. I asked the Lord to help me never to cry before them. No matter what they did, I never shed a tear before them. Oh, they knew how to use judo chops on you. I thought many times he was going to break my neck. And then with his finger, he would flick me right between my eyes. Didn't realize that was such a sensitive place. The doctor said there are many nerves there. And my eyes became black and blue. and I would answer their questions that I know I did not have a radio. No, sir, I did not go into the jungle. I have never reported to any of the Allies anything about troop movements. I don't know anything about them. I don't know anything about your planes. I have never had contact with anybody from the native sector. No, sir, I did not have a radio. What did you do with the radio? I said, sir, I never had a radio. No matter what you said, they wouldn't believe you. The man that was just out of my line of vision would make the questions, and this fellow would turn them into the Indonesian language, and he would shoot them at me. And I'd say, sir, I am innocent. I did not spy on the Japanese. I have never been outside of that camp. I don't know anything about it, your soldiers. I don't know anything about where you have your encampments. And it didn't make any difference what you said. Even though they tried to brainwash you and they beat you and other things, I never shed a tear. But I'll be honest with you tonight. When I got back to that cell, and the guard would lock the door, and I knew he was gone, he couldn't hear me, I wept literally buckets of tears. And I cried and I said, please, Jesus, I can't go through another one. Please, Lord, no more, no more. I can't do it. And always he would say to me, but my child, my grace is sufficient for you. I didn't know why I had felt I had to memorize a poem by Annie Johnson Flint. Two of our missionaries had set it to music. When the Lord would say, listen, my child, my grace is sufficient for you, I would sit up in the cell and I'd take that skirt of my dress and I would wipe up all the tears lest the guard come back and find them. Then I would begin to sing, He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance and our strength is failed ere the day's half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving is only begun. His love has no limit. His grace has no measure. His power has no boundary known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. And I could go through another one and another one. Till finally I knew I was to be executed. They told me that I was to be executed as an American spy. I had continually lost weight. I had malaria now. One day I needed some air and I climbed up the bars of the window. I was glad that I'd had gymnastics and swimming. I had strong arms and I pulled myself up the bars till I could reach the transom above the door. The minute I got up there and I was waiting for the air to strike my face, I looked down and there was a knife on the ledge. I dropped to the floor and I was shaking. I said, Lord, I think they've planted that there. They're going to try to make out that I've had contact with somebody to have gotten that knife. I don't know where it came from, Lord. And then I got my dress and I went and I wiped off all my fingerprints everywhere that I could find. And I sat down on the floor and oh, the fear that came over me because I knew somebody had put that knife there. And I said, Lord, if they find it, they will say they have evidence against me that somebody was getting a knife to me. For 3 days I prayed, and I prayed that God would remove that knife somehow. And I said, Lord, if you could make that axe head to swim, if you could lift that iron up out of that water until it surfaced to the top, I said, Lord, it's nothing for you to remove that knife, Lord, before they find it. 3 days I waited and I prayed and I said, Lord, you can take it away. And I went up, I pulled myself up the bars of the window, and I had not left my room in all those days. And I looked there, the knife was gone. Do you believe he is who he said he was? I do. I had become very, very ill. When I came out of that cell, I weighed 60 pounds. This one day I was having a fever again, the malaria, and I would shake with the chills, and then the terrible fever would come over me, and it was cerebral malaria that usually is fatal. And this day I said, Lord, I really need some air. So I pulled myself up until I got hold of the bars of the window. And then I looked out and I saw that the guard was coming. He was bringing the native women who were there for just minor misdemeanors. And there was Miss Kemp also. She looked so terrible. And I was watching them. And suddenly I realized that there was something about one woman that was with the group. Every time the guard with his gun on his arm went in that direction, this woman would scurry off in the other direction. And I watched her and I looked down there and I thought, there she goes and there he goes. Oh, he's coming back now. Here she's standing there as though she hadn't been doing anything. And he clicked his heels down here and then he went off in that direction again. And I watched her and there she was. She was headed for that fence at the end of the courtyard. And I thought, if she wants to go over by the fence, why didn't she just go over there by the fence? But no, this time he went back. And when she got to the fence, I saw a hand come through that fence. And on that hand was a whole bunch of bananas. And she put it in under her sarong and she walked away, and nobody knew she had those bananas, but I did. I could smell bananas. I could remember the flavor of bananas. And I looked at those bananas when he passed them over. They had disappeared now, and I just dropped down off of that door and I got on my knees and I said, Lord, I'm not asking you for a whole bunch like she has. I just want one banana, Lord. Then I began to figure out how God could get a banana into that cell to me. Don't tell me you haven't done it. Try to figure out how God could answer your prayer. And I said, Lord, now there are 4 possibilities. These are the 2 men, Lord, that have been trying me. Neither one of those men would ever bring me a banana. I know that. And this is that guard that's on duty in the daytime, and I know he wouldn't bring me a banana. And I said, then there is this older Indonesian man that comes at night to guard. I think he might even bring me a banana, but Lord, please, you mustn't ask him. If he were caught bringing a banana to me, they'd just shoot him. So I said, Lord, please don't even let him think about bringing me a banana, will you? And I said, Lord, there's no way you could ever get a banana into this cell to me. And I said, please don't think that I'm not grateful. I really am grateful for the rice porridge. I just saw that banana and I thought I wanted one. The next day, I heard officers coming. Often when ships were in, you were put out on display before these men. And I said, Lord, I really need strength to stand on my feet so that when I get out there, I can make a proper bow to them. And I said, Lord, help me to bow low enough so that they won't hit me across the back with their canes, which they always carried. But when that door of the cell opened, I looked, and in the door stood our Japanese camp commander from that other camp from which I had been brought down to the prison. And he was smiling. And the months had gone by, and this was the first time I'd ever seen a smile on anyone's face. I was so thrilled to see that man, to see that smile on his face, and I just clapped my hands and I said, "Oh, Tuan Yamaji, seperti lihat sobat yang lama, Mr. Yamaji, it's like seeing a friend." And I saw the big tears come in his eyes, and he turned and walked right back out of the cell without a word. And he began to talk to those two men who had been trying me. And I saw their heads getting lower and lower as he talked and talked. I don't really know what he said, but I've always felt that what he was telling them was what I had said to him the day when I heard that Russell had been gone for 3 months. The late afternoon, Mr. Yamaji called me over to his office, and he said, "Nyonya, this is war." I said, "Yes, sir, I understand that." He said, "What you heard this afternoon, many women in Japan have heard." I said, "I understand that, sir." He said, "You're very young, and someday the war really will be over. And you can go back to America, and you can go dancing and go to the theaters, and you can forget all about these awful days. You can marry again." And I said, "Sir, may I have permission to speak to you?" You never spoke to them without first asking permission, or they just instinctively threw up their hand and smacked you across the mouth. I said, "May I have permission to speak to you?" And yes, and he pointed to a chair on the other side of his desk, and I sat down on it, and I said, "Mr. Yamaji, I want to tell you about someone perhaps you've never heard about. I didn't know who he was until I was a little girl, just 9 years of age, back in America, in Boone, Iowa. His name is Jesus, the Son of God." I said, "That's why I don't hate you." I said, "God brought me out here to tell people that God loved them and Christ died for them." And I said, "That's why I don't hate you." I said, "I don't even know. Maybe this is why God brought me here, Mr. Yamaji, to tell you that he loves you and he died for you. And that through his blood you can know what it is to be clean from your sin." And by this time the tears were just running down his cheeks. And I said, "Mr. Yamaji, I don't sorrow like people who have no hope. I know that someday I'll see Russell again over there." And I said, "He loves you, Mr. Yamaji." I said, "Maybe God brought me here just for you. I don't know. But if you were to believe, it would be worth everything that it's cost me." He got up, couldn't control his tears anymore, and he went into his room. I could hear him crying and blowing his nose in there. I only know this, that from that moment on, that man was my friend. He made me head over the whole camp toward the end after the bombings. I think that's what he was telling those men, because they became very quiet and their heads went down. I didn't know at the time, but these men had been up to the camp and told Mr. Yamaji and the women that I was never to be returned to the camp because I was dying of tuberculosis, they said, not wanting them to know that I was to be beheaded. Mr. Yamaji came back into the cell, and he looked down at me and he said, "Oh, you are very ill, aren't you?" And I said, "Sir, I am." He said, "I'm going back to the camp now, and I just wanted to know if there was any word you had for the women. Everybody's asking about where you are, what's happened to you." And I said, "Mr. Yamaji, when you go back, would you tell those women that I am all right, and they will understand, and I think, Mr. Yamaji, you will understand, I'm all right because I'm still trusting in the Lord." He nodded to me, he turned, he walked out of the cell, the door was locked, and as soon as I heard them going, I remembered I hadn't bowed to those Kempetai men. Oh, the fear that came over me, and I said, "God, please, why didn't you help me to remember?" Because just as soon as Mr. Yamaji's gone, that guard's going to come back here and he's going to get me and he's going to take me back to the hearing room, and please, God, I don't want to go back there anymore. And then I heard the guard coming. So I stood up and I said, Lord, once more, please help me not to shed any tears. The door opened and in walked the guard, and he just laid them all out on the floor in front of me. He said, they're all yours. They're all from Mr. Yamaji. You know what they were, don't you? They were bananas. I don't know how you would feel, but never in my walk with my Lord have I felt such shame before him. And I just pushed him over in the corner. After counting them, there were 92 bananas. And I said, Lord, I don't have any right to eat those. I said, yesterday I was telling you, here they are, 4 people, and that's all. And there's no way you could get a banana in here to me. And I said, Lord, look what you've done. I said, it's almost 100-fold. So sweetly the Lord said to me, but my child, that's the way I delight to do things, the exceeding abundant above anything you ask or think. Then I wanted to eat them all at once. I knew I didn't dare to, because I knew that I would be eating it off the floor again if I did. And I said, Lord, I don't have much character, but would you just help me to not eat any more bananas than my body can assimilate at each time. And one day, I was very ill, and I hardly had the strength to get up off the floor. And I would crawl over and I would get the bananas. They were black now, and I'd take 1 and then 2, and then I would leave it. And I sat there realizing that if they didn't behead me, that I probably would die anyway of starvation. I was that sick. And all of a sudden I heard the most beautiful singing. It was like an angel chorus. And somebody was singing outside. And it was singing in the Indonesian language because it's so beautiful there. Oh, how sweet the name of Jesus. It's like a refuge in time of trouble. And my heart just swelled when I heard those words. And I said, Lord, I'm still under the shadow of your wings. And I climbed up to the transom above the door, and I thought, whoever that is out there, I would like to see their face. I would like to hear them singing. And when I got up there and I leaned out and I looked in every direction, there was no one there except a guard and the girl from the desk, and they were talking and laughing. They weren't hearing that singing. And suddenly great awe came over me. I got down off the door. I said, Lord, that was an angel singing, wasn't it? The voice went on. It sang to me until my heart thrilled with his presence. I was telling this to Dr. A.W. Tozer. I don't know if you know him. He was a great man of God. He said to me, girl, did you ever think that that was an angel? I said, yes, I did. There was no one there, and yet that voice was singing to me. One day the Lord began to speak to me from 3 phrases of a verse that says, who delivered from so great a death. Who delivered and doth deliver, he will yet deliver. And I said, Lord, I know you've delivered me from the law of sin and death. I know that I belong to you. And up to this moment you have kept me. And he would go right back to the beginning and say, who delivered and doth deliver, he will yet deliver. And I said, God, how could you get me out of this place? And God was trying to make me to know. That day when I picked up the last banana and I peeled it, here came the guard and he said, quickly, we're going to take you somewhere else. And when we started out in that car to go back to the camp, we would had to have turned left, and we didn't. We went right to the Gestapo headquarters,
We spoke of it as the Gestapo because it was patterned after the German Gestapo. We went right to the headquarters. We were taken into a room. Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley were told to sign and write out and sign a paper how grateful they were to the Imperial Japanese Army for being so kind to them and for having forgiven them, and because they were going to release them. And Margaret was so shaky she couldn't write, and she turned to me and she said, "Darlene, would you write this for us?" And went on to say that they were grateful to the Imperial Japanese Army for their goodness. And then the two of them had to put their thumbprint on it. And then the man came over to me. They were taken into the other part of the headquarters building, and I was there where the executions took place. He walked up in front of me, the brains of the team, and he held out this big sheaf of papers, all the things that he had written. He went through them. He said I was guilty of having had a radio, that I had been in contact with the Allies. I'd reported on troop movements, that I knew where the Allies were and the Japanese, and that I had been giving all of this information to their enemy. And then he looked at me and he said, "You have done those things whereof you're worthy of death," and drew his finger across his throat and grabbed his sword at his side, and he began to pull it out. And while that sword was coming out, my heart was singing, "I'll live for him who died for me." And I said, "Lord, that's a strange song when I'm going to die." And just as he was beginning to pull that out of there, I suddenly heard sound of vehicles, of all kinds of vehicles, running up to the front of that building, honking their horns, screeching their brakes, and they ran into the building. It was ceramic tile on the floor. They wore the high jack boots with the leather heels, and they were running back and forth and yelling for this man. And he shoved that back down into the sheath, and then he ran into the headquarters. And they were talking in there at the top of their lungs. And I stood there and waited. Somebody said, "Why didn't you run away?" "Where would you run to? There's no place to run." And I stood there quietly waiting for him to come back to finish the execution. And suddenly he came and he grabbed a hold of my arm. He took me out and put me into a car, and soldiers jumped in behind me. He jumped in. And then he put 2 bottles of wine, and he said, "When you get back, you give those to Mr. Yamaji." We were going like we were top secret material. I don't know what happened that day. I only know that when we lost all of our men, and others of those godly missionaries died, somehow in the providence of God, he spared me. And I vowed that day, for any days that were ever left to me, they were all his. When we got back to the camp and we were just to cross the moat and go in the gate, that man behind me, who was the brains of this team that had been trying me, he reached up and my arm was just the bone with skin drawn over it. He grabbed my arm and I was sure he was going to break it. I bit my lip trying to keep from screaming. It hurt so bad as he twisted it. He said, "If you ever tell anybody anything that's happened to you, I'll be back and I will get you." And oh, the fear that came over me, thinking I wasn't free of them. When we got there, I just motioned for someone to come. "Please take Miss Kemp and Miss Seeley." They put Miss Kemp in the hospital. She weighed in at 90 pounds. And Miss Seeley was so bad that she was beginning to run away and do terrible things. And so they took her down and put her in a little shed that had bars in front of it so that she couldn't get out. And they locked the door on her. And I started back. Nobody seemed to even have the courage to come and say, "We're glad you're back." And I looked at them. And as soon as I got around the bend so that nobody from the office could see, Ruth Presswood put her arm around me and she took me in. And I saw that her mirror was hanging there. And I looked in it and I said, "Ruth, my hair." It was white.
She just nodded and the tears started down over her cheeks. When they weighed me, I weighed 60 pounds. I had just left her, and all of a sudden, here came a woman who had been a prostitute for the Japanese. Everybody feared her. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with her. And there she was, and she motioned for me to come out into the little dining area. And here she had a washcloth, and I saw my name embroidered on it. And she said, I was down in prison too, and your Indonesian friend, Visha, was in the cell with me. And she said, I asked her if she wanted to send anything to you. And so she made this for you, and there was my name embroidered on it. And I knew she was trying to trick me. And I remembered the words of that man, if you ever have contact with anybody outside of this camp, I'll get you the next time. And I said, Mrs. Klaus, I am not going to take that. She said, you have to take it. I said, no, I don't have to take that. I'm not going to take that. I said, they told me I could have nothing to do with anybody outside. I said, you're trying to trick me. She was so angry with me. She was absolutely white. And so she was screaming at me. She said, I risked my life, she said, to bring that to you. Mrs. Presswood heard her. She came out, and she said, what's the matter, Darlene? And I started to cry. I said, she's trying to trick me. She's brought this. She's trying to make it appear that I had contact with Visha. And Mrs. Presswood reached over and grabbed her arm. She said, if I ever see you near her again, I don't know what I'm going to do to you. And fear came on me, fear that I was going to be taken back again. And days I would go out and I would work, and I'd come home, and I didn't dare to sleep. I was afraid I was going to lose my mind, and I would go to the hospital. Margaret Kemp's memory was gone. And I would go down, and I asked if I could work with the chickens because I could be near Miss Seeley. And I could hear her in there, and I would go up and try to put my hands around hers and talk to her. And then I would turn away, and I'd think, God, look at these women of such faith. And who am I? I'm the youngest of all of them. And look at these women of such tremendous faith, so broken, Father. And that fear stayed with me. I didn't care to go to sleep at night. And 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, I worked. And at night, I couldn't sleep. I was afraid to. I was afraid my mind would go while I was sleeping. I would just drop off to sleep, and then I'd wake up, and I was just perspired because of the fear that was on me. And I would sit up and I'd say, Lord, I've tried to trust you. I've tried in every way I could to be a good soldier for you. And please, Lord, I can't go on any longer. And finally I went out and I walked on a grassy plot back behind the area where we ate. And I said, God, I've tried with everything that was within me to keep my mind. And I said, I need sleep now. I'm not well. And I can't go on like this. And I literally threw my arms out. I said, I'm gone, I'm gone, I'm gone. It was just like arms went underneath me. And I began to sing a song written by Dr. A.B. Simpson. It says, underneath thee, oh, how precious. You have not to mount on high, but to rest upon his promise and in trustful resting lie. And I saw it. I've been trying to reach up to God. I've been trying to commend myself to God. And when we've done the best that we can, we're still unprofitable servants. And the arms went underneath me, and billows of peace just rolled over me, and all the fear was gone. The fear of going back under them, these men again. And God just filled me with his presence. We'd had bombings the year before. We had dug our own slit trenches so that we could have some protection. They were bombing the airfields. Shrapnel was flying into the camp. And no matter whether it was raining at night or not, we had, as soon as the alarm went, we heard planes in the distance, we had to get out and we had to get into those ditches. And many's the night when I stood with an improvised spear that my boys had made for me, the boys that were there. When I speak of my boys, these were the young men who were from the families that were there in the barracks over which I was head. And they'd made this spear, and I would watch for mad dogs, because we had mad dogs coming into the camp. The Salavis is known for rabid dogs, rabies everywhere at certain times of the year. And we had some that were bitten by them. There was nothing to give them. All you could do was just lock them in a shed out at the edge of the camp and wait for death to come. Horrible, horrible death. We had lost more being bitten by the mad dogs than we did to the bombings. And we had not had in all those years any letters, Red Cross packages, no pamphlets, nothing. We were locked away within that camp. We didn't know what was happening in the outside world. And 1 year and 2 years and 3 years, and we were coming to our 4th year. And I remember that one day when just about noon we saw a plane, a lone plane, coming out of the east, and as it came down over the camp, it was low enough so that we could see American insignia on the side. An American boy was flying that plane. And then where he suddenly dropped over our camp, one of the auxiliary gasoline tanks. I felt angry. I thought, how dare you do that with all these women and children here? How dare you drop that over us? But I think he was trying to warn us that they were coming the next day. But none of us got the message. We didn't know where the Americans were. It came to the place where you thought, I'll spend the rest of my life in this camp of 2 acre square behind this barbed wire and the moat on the outside of the barbed wire. And then the next day we looked, and just about noon, we heard the sound of planes, and we all ran out and we stopped. We were starved for news in all those years. We'd never had one Red Cross package, never any letters from home, never any letters or pamphlets from anywhere. We were just locked inside the barbed wire of that camp. And we looked up. We saw suddenly that there were many planes coming. They were moving out of the east, and they were coming toward our camp, and everybody got out there and stopped their work, and we dropped our shovels and our picks, and we looked up at all these planes coming, beautiful double fuselage planes. We'd never seen them before, P-38 Lightnings, and suddenly there were silver things coming from the backs of the planes, and some were yelling, canned goods. And I said, no chocolate bars, and others were saying, no, they're pamphlets, and we were all yelling something. And then we heard the whistling of the bombs, and we knew we were wrong. And over that little camp of 2 acre square, they laid 5,000 incendiary bombs. In just minutes, everything was going up in flames. I jumped into the ditch where we were supposed to lie when there were bombings. And the minute my feet hit the bottom of that ditch, the Lord said, you borrowed a Bible from that little Chinese woman. I said, that's right, Lord. I've no right to let it burn. And I jumped out of the ditch, and I ran to the barracks that was burning, and I grabbed that Bible off of my upper rack, and I came out, and I saw that they finally had opened the gate so we could get out of this burning holocaust. And I ran to the gate with others, and we went through it. We got down there, and here we were just in a beehive of Japanese soldiers. There were 138,000 soldiers around that camp. We didn't even know they were there. They had their machine guns set up, and they yelled T-door and you T-door. They just turned on you with their guns with the bayonets fixed on them, and you just threw yourself out on the ground, and they were running over the tops of us to get to their machine guns, and they began to machine gun the planes, and of course the planes just turned around and came down, and they strafed us with machine gun bullets. And I dropped my hand onto my head onto my hand, and I said, God, if at the end of this day anybody's alive, it will be a miracle. When the last of the planes had gone, and the sound of the planes was no longer audible, and I could see that all of these things that had been burning had stopped burning, and there was smoke coming up out of the camp. And I thought, Lord, I'm alive. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. I finally found Mrs. Presswood. I said, let's go back up to where our barracks was. Maybe we can find our tin cans, our spoons, something that has been preserved even in the fire. We got up to where the barracks had been, and nobody knew that I had my bride's book sewn inside a native mat. How it happened, only God knows. But when that barracks burned, it fell backwards. The beds came down, the mat burned away, and must have been the wind that blew the bride's book open. And there in the center, on that beautiful black page, was this brilliant gold ink standing out of the certificate. And I looked down at it, and the sun, the last rays of the sun, was making that gold to shine. And I said, Lord, that was the only thing I had left. Couldn't I just have that? And the minute I touched it, it just completely disintegrated. I said, that was all I had. And he said to me, my child, that's what I want to do with you. I want to make you like pure gold, even if I have to take you through the fire 7 times. I stood up and I said, all right, Lord, I'm available. I saw that the lady in the barracks, head of the barracks next to me, was crying, and I went over to her and I put my arm around her and I said, please don't cry. She said, my mattress burned. I said, oh yes, everything's burned, but we have much to thank God for. We're still alive. She said, but I didn't leave it in the barracks. I grabbed it off my bed and I took it out and I threw it in the ditch where you always lie. I walked over to that ditch, and right there where I had been lying was the ashes from her mattress and the casing from the bomb. I stood up, I walked away. I have never known such awe in the presence of my Lord. And I said, Father, it wasn't that woman's Bible you were concerned about, was it? You knew that was one way to get me out of that ditch. They put us in shacks. They knew that this bombing was coming, and there were shacks up there in the wilderness. And 3 days later, we had a bombing, a shrapnel bomb. And there were those that were killed, children without arms and legs, and one of the young men was from our barracks, and others whose legs had been chopped off by the force of the bomb hitting them. I remember the day when finally, at the end of August 1945, we were called out, and there was Mr. Umaji, and there were the others standing there, all in dress uniform, and they told us that there had been an announcement on the radio by the Imperial Japanese Emperor Hirohito that there was to be a cessation of all fighting. I have seen pictures of the victory celebrations in San Francisco and New York and other big cities. And I thought that wasn't the way it was that day. I couldn't imagine leaving the camp. I didn't know where I was going. And they allowed me to go up and act as the interpreter for the Japanese and the Allied officials, because I knew English, I knew the Indonesian, I knew the Dutch. And Mr. Umaji had dismissed the other man who was a translator, and he took me in to help. And through this, the Australian major gave word to the American boys who were on the coast. And out of 300 that were reported there when the war started and they were taken prisoner, only 97 of those boys survived. And they had rigged up a little radio and sent out an SOS, and it was picked up by an American plane that went over. And those American planes were coming in, and they were ferrying those boys out to get them to medical help. And this major said, there is an American boy who's going to come up and see you. The American told us that the Philippines had over 6 months been free, and why nothing was ever said to us. We were still their prisoners. And I one day walked back to the little shack up in the jungle, and I heard the sound of a man's voice, and I looked, and coming up the pathway was this young man all in white. My, he looked beautiful. He was so squeaky clean, and he had shoes that were so highly polished that you could see yourself in them. And I thought, oh my, I've never seen such all-togetherness in my life. We had after the bombing, we had about one comb for 9 people, and livestock was plentiful. And I just cut my hair off just real short because as far as we knew, the war would go on for years yet. And I was a mess. My feet, of course, we had never had shoes in all those years, and that was good for strengthening our feet. But when this boy came in, and he was an American boy, and he was very well dressed because they had gotten clothes from the Americans who were ferrying them out, and he said, I understand there's an American girl here, and someone pointed me out, and I felt so embarrassed because he kept looking at my feet, and they weren't all that dirty, and I was so embarrassed I sat down on the edge of this little hut, and I pulled my feet up underneath me, and he said, don't you have any shoes? And I said, oh no, we haven't had shoes, but that's all right. I said, that's good for your feet. He said, I'm going to get you some shoes. And I was in my work shorts and a sleeveless blouse because everything else had burned in the bombing. He said, oh, sorry, he said, I should have introduced myself. I'm Tom Sawyer, and I'm with the American Navy. And it was on the tip of my tongue to say, sure, and I'm Becky Thatcher. But I didn't know if he had a sense of humor or not, so I decided I better not. So I said, I'm Darlene Deibler from Boone, Iowa. And so he wanted to know what I needed, and I said, oh, combs and soap, but most of all, we need food for the children. He said, can you mark out a place where I can do a free drop for you tomorrow? We'll get you food and whatever else you need. And they did. I marked it out. I went to Mr. Yamaji. He gave me the white cloth in order to mark out the space on this old rice field. And that day when the friction type lid on the top of these tins, when the tin would hit the ground, that friction type lid would just blow off, and everything was pouring out of there, and the little children were screaming. They thought they were more bombs, and we tried to explain to them that those weren't bombs, that those were containing food. And I was out there with the rest of them. We were trying to get these things up, and I found a can of sweetened condensed milk that had burst when it hit the ground. And so I thought, that's a terrible thing to let that be wasted. So I pulled it up, and what was left in there, I ran it into my hand, and then I licked it off there. It was beautiful, but it wasn't long till it came back the other way. I said, it's the only time I ever enjoyed food going both ways. And then one day they said, well, we're going to take you now because the American boys have been flown out. Those boys suffered as I have seldom heard of suffering. They were beaten with iron pipes. And sometimes they said it would be 200 times, and the people would faint, and they pour water on them and beat them again till their bodies were like pulp. But they were flying those that had survived out to get medical aid. And they said, if you want to go, we'll take you on the last plane load. So I remember the day when I went down there with Miss Kemp. Miss Seeley, we couldn't get her to come, and so she was being put in a place where they could look after her. And that day when I stood there, all I could see in my mind's eye were 2 lonely crosses on a jungle hill. Under one was my husband, under the other was Dr. R.A. Jaffrey. They had taken the men on a death march, and many of them never came back. And I thought about that, and I thought, here I arrived on my first wedding anniversary, and I'm going home widowed at 26 with not a thing I can call my own. Even the clothes I have, I've borrowed. I said, Lord, I don't think I'll ever come back to these islands again. And I remember that day when I got in a little boat to go out to this Catalina. And I had such bitterness rise up in my heart. And suddenly I heard the sound of running feet, and I turned around in the boat and I looked. And there were the Christians. And they'd gathered on the shore,
And they started to wave and sing, God be with you till we meet again.
And the tears burst out. And I said, God, that's right. That's why I came to these islands. Not because I was Reverend Deibler's wife. I came here because one day, as a little girl, I stood in a missionary meeting, the closing service. I was about the second row from the back. All of the appeal was made for high school and college young people. Nobody noticed this little girl with brown hair sitting there at the back. And when we stood up, and I heard the appeal made to them, and he spoke to me, and he said, would you go anywhere for me, no matter what it costs? I was so thrilled to think that God had even noticed me. And I said to him that night, Lord Jesus, I'd go anywhere for you, no matter what it costs. And as I turned and I looked, and God broke my heart, and I called out to them, someday I will come home again to you. It took me 3 years before I passed a physical. On the way home, they took us to Baliem, Papua. They took us to the hospital immediately, and they said, is there anything special you'd like to have? And I said, I'd like a shower. We had so little soap and so little water, and I said, I would like to have a hot shower. Could we have a hot shower? And so they said, oh, yes. Well, I didn't say hot because I didn't think anybody had hot showers anymore, but they took us there, and there was hot water, and and soap, and it smelled nice. And we just showered and soaped, and then we'd rinse, and then we'd soap some more, and I don't know how long we were in there until we heard the sound of a knock on the door and said, girls, we have tea ready. See, this was an Australian camp. We have tea ready for you, and if you want a shower later on, you can have another shower. So we sat down at the table. I tell you, it was an unusual experience to be using a knife and fork. Again, we have Welsh rarebit. And it just tasted so delicious. And then that night we got into the hospital. I tell you, I didn't realize what a terrible thing a bed was. That thing had a give to it, and every time in the night when I would turn, that thing was turning over, and I knew I was being thrown out or it was an earthquake. And I'd grab the sides of the bed, and I whispered to Margaret, are you sleeping? And she said, I can't sleep. And she said, let's get out and get on the floor. I said, that's a good idea. Let's get out and we'll sleep there, and then we'll wake up and jump back into bed before all these nurses see us. And then we talked it over a little more and said, what do we do if they catch us on the floor? We decided we better stay in bed. They had gone out and gotten pajamas for us. They thought and I said, oh, we're used to sleeping in our clothes. They said, tonight you're not sleeping in them. And all I could find were some pajamas that belonged to these Australian troops. And they were these very tall people. And I remember putting on those trousers, and I got it right up to here. And I said, oh, I don't need this top. But I thought I won't have much movement in my arms, so I pulled it down and rolled up the legs. And then I put my arm in this one and rolled it up till I found this hand, then I rolled this one up. And finally, we all laughed, and we were in bed. And they said, tonight you're not sleeping in your clothes. And then the next day, after we had had tea in the morning, here came a jeep. And they took us out and they said, we're taking you on the last plane load of each one of the hops between here and Manila. So then they took us up to Palawan Island, and I saw that large cemetery out there, white stones marking the place where many American boys laid down their lives. I am a patriot. I believe in America. And I'm glad that God allowed me to be born here, to learn about Him, to have a Bible. When I was a child, I had a compulsion to memorize Scripture. I memorized books of the Bible, chapters, Psalms.
that didn't matter that they took my Bible away from me, because it was all there, and God played it back to me. I wonder if you lost your Bible tonight, how well off would you be? You don't know when it's going to be taken away from you. Even to your hymns, I see you all with your hymn books up there in front of you. You ought to have it down here, because God does minister to music, through music. And I remember when we got into Baliem Island, and I looked down, and we were still had the mentality of a POW. And when I saw that white buildings painted white, all the men in white, I said to Miss Kemp, they are not very well camouflaged. And there they were, and they were all in dress uniform. And I thought, they don't know who's coming. We're just POWs. I wonder who they really expected. But when we got up there, and there was a sidewalk up to this big dining hall, and there were men on both sides standing at attention. Boy, my heart just burst with pride seeing those boys. And then when we got inside, someone struck up the band, and they started to play Star Spangled Banner, and they unfurled that beautiful flag down in the center. I tell you, I went to pieces. I just cried and cried and cried. They'd come up and they'd pat us on the shoulder, and he said, don't cry, you're free now. And I said, I know. But there were so many times I thought I'd never see that beautiful flag. They said, don't cry, it's all right. It's all right. We're going to have dinner now. And I tried to straighten up my face, and I tried to get these closed so they looked a little better, because it was about a size 16 on a size 6 body. And I had taken a belt and tied it real tight and cinched it around, and I bloused it up over the top of it so that the hem, the bottom of the hem wasn't down about to my ankles. But when we walked in, and I saw all that white linen on the tablecloths, and they put us up at the head table, and everyone was smiling to us, and I thought, if I eat all this that's here in front of me, I'm going to be sick, but it's going to be worth it this time. And everyone was so pleased, and they just tried to do everything for us. And that night they had outside a film that they were showing, and we sat down. I don't remember anything about the film, but I remember the ice cream and the chocolates. And then the next day they were all out there ready to see us on our way. We were the last camp that was ever found. So this was the closing up of bringing the POWs in. And then we dropped down in Manila, and they said, here's a bus. I tell you, that man who drove that bus, he would have done well, the Indianapolis 500. And we just hung on to the backs and the sides of the seat to keep from being rolled into the aisle of the bus. They finally got us there. And one of the first things they did was to give us a physical, and they said, oh my. And they laid out all these vitamins that we had to take, and the medicine. I said, sir, after I've eaten all those, I'm not going to need anything else. I won't have room for it. And then they said, here, you go over, we're going to see that you get a permanent. I thought, isn't that beautiful? I like doctors that write out prescriptions for a permanent. And so they got our hair fixed up, and then they brought in the boxes from the Red Cross, and the first place I wanted to find was the post office, and I went over, and I said, would you have any mail for Darlene Deibler? He looked, he said, I'm sorry, I don't. And I went back day after day, and finally he said, boy, I don't know why somebody wouldn't write to you. And I was so embarrassed I didn't go back again. And till the day I was to be taken out, and the ship came, the Clip Fontaine, and they had left us there for almost a month because they didn't feel we were strong enough even to go on a ship. But finally they put us on 23 days outside of San Francisco. We were supposed to dock in San Francisco. We just gone in under the Golden Gate, and I saw all those lights of San Francisco. Everybody was so excited. Oh, that beautiful city. I said, I don't care. I said, I don't know anybody out here, no one at all. I had an auntie that lived down south, but I don't know where she is. I don't even know the address. And everybody was ohing and awing, and I was feeling, Lord, what am I going to do when I get off this ship?
And then I saw the lights. Oh, I said to Margaret, don't they know that a war's on? No, it is not. And I was so fascinated with lights that you had turned on everywhere. And then we were just getting ready to pull in, and suddenly the loudspeaker was turned on, and they said, we're pulling out again because the whole harbor is full. There are no berths empty. So they're going to take you on up to Seattle, Washington, and there you will be taken off the ship. I was so glad to spend another 2 days on that ship. That was known territory. When I got off there, I hadn't had any letter from my mother and dad, and I hadn't heard from anybody. And I thought, when I get there, I don't know where I'm going. And when we finally docked, it was Navy Day, and they said, tonight we will delouse you, and then tomorrow we'll start processing you. I was glad to spend another night on that ship. And we were sleeping 3 deep in hammocks out on the deck. There were so many POWs of us. Then the next morning, I saw my friends leaving, and I saw them going down the gangplank and meeting their families and their friends out there. And I stood there at the rail, and suddenly it struck me. The reason you haven't heard from Mother and Dad is that they're gone. And I went back and I crawled in underneath of those hammocks. And I said, Lord, you took Russell. Did you have to take Mother and Daddy also? So sweetly my Lord spoke to me, and he said, my child, you can still trust me. I said, all right, Father, but I need to find a Red Cross woman. I've been looking for one all morning. And I said, I haven't seen them. And I came around the corner of the deck of the ship, and I saw a Red Cross woman, and I latched onto her, and I said, you wait a minute, now you have to help me. I said, I'm a POW. And I said, it's been over 4 years. I haven't heard anything from my father and mother. I don't know where they are, but I need money. I've got to get back to Iowa to trace anybody from the family that's alive. And she said, honey, what's your name? I said, Darlene Deibler. She said, I've been on the ship all morning looking for you. 3 telegrams. They're all from Mother and Dad. And I opened them up. Mother said, we moved out to Oakland, California in 1942. And we knew you were on the ship, and we wanted to get there in order to greet you. But when they took you on up to Seattle, we wouldn't have time to get there. And so we've sent money to the Western Union office. And you go there and you get that money, and you get a ticket on the train and come down, and we'll be here to meet you. And you call collect as soon as you can get to a telephone. I went to get my ticket first after getting the money. And I looked at everybody who was going by me on the street, and I thought, oh my, just look at their coats. It's all that real tight nap this year. And I looked down at this coat I'd gotten from the Red Cross, and I looked like a bear. It was a real long, shaggy thing. And I went back to the ship, and I asked the captain if I could borrow his razor. And he looked at me rather puzzled, and I found a secluded spot on the deck, and I gave my coat a shave. And it really looked pretty good. Then I went to the train station, and I went up to the window, and I said, please, sir, I would like to have a ticket for Oakland, California. He said, my dear, don't you know a war's been on? Only Army, Navy, Air Force personnel travel. I was just ready to faint. And I said, sir, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. I said, I'm a POW, and I just got here, and I'm trying to get home. Oh, he said, we've got lots of tickets for people like you. And I was in business again. And then I got over to a telephone, and my goodness, it wasn't one of those things that just was on the wall, and you lift up the thing and then someone says, number please. And I said, here was this round thing there, and it had numbers and it had letters. And I was standing there, and I thought, now how am I going to use this thing? And somebody who must have known how puzzled I was, he stepped up and he just shoved the door open a little bit, and he said, could I help you? And I said, yeah, I'm a POW. I don't know how to operate that thing, and I'm trying to call my folks. And he said, what's the number? And I said, this is the number. And so I said, call collect. And so he rang it through for me. And you know, I've said so many times tonight,
the Lord spoke to me. And people say, how do you know it's the Lord? This is the best illustration I know. When I got that call went through, and I heard the receiver going up on the other end, and I heard someone say, hello, Darlene. I knew it was Mother. Nobody ever said my name like Mother did. I hadn't heard her voice in 8 years, but it was Mother. I said, hello, Mother. Then I couldn't say another thing. She so calmly told me that my brother had just gotten in from Germany in New York the night before, and he said, Mother, did you hear anything from Darlene? I said, And then she went on to tell me about my daddy and about everybody. And all I could say was, I couldn't answer. I was crying so hard. She said, now, honey, you just go and you just be sure that you get on that train, and we'll be here to meet you. Somebody told me that I really needed to have a good foundation garment. Well, at that moment, I didn't have a thing to girdle. But I went and I decided I'd get something that looked decent, and I'd gotten the money from the Western Union. And then I thought, I'm going to be on that train for a day and a night, and I better have a suitcase. And so I went and got a suitcase and a purse, and I put what little money I had in there. I got on that train. I suddenly realized at Portland, Oregon, I had not told Mother and Dad what train I was coming in on. So it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and so I went out and I found a man who would take my telegram. And I didn't realize it was just sent right through. It was phoned right through. And I said, kill the fatted calf. Love, Darlene. I'm arriving at 9:30 tomorrow morning. And then I got back on the train, not realizing that it was being phoned directly through. And Dad said that when that telephone began to ring, Mother jumped up and she ran to the telephone. He said, all I could hear was, what? And then something would be repeated, and she said, what? And then evidently the girl laughed, and she said, have you not heard of the lost son, the prodigal son? The lost is found. Kill the fatted calf. She said thank you and put the receiver down quickly and ran in and shook my dad, and they laughed. She said she's all right. She hasn't lost her sense of humor. And then the next morning, when it rolled into the depot in Oakland, California, I was looking for two faces. And I finally spotted my father the time he saw me. And he was waving to me, Darlene, Darlene. He always called me baby. He said, baby. And he turned and yelled, Mother, she's here, she's here. And my father came up, he put his arms around me, and Mother joined us. And I said, Daddy, Mother, I thought so many times I would never, ever see you again. And as I looked out over the tops of their heads, the sun broke through the clouds, those beautiful clouds. And suddenly I thought, oh, Lord, someday those clouds will part asunder, and you will be there, and I will know you. For with the eyes of my spirit, I've looked into that beautiful face. I have no regrets for any of the things that God has led me through. I wonder about you young people. I was on a field where we had more graves than live missionaries. I'll tell you this tonight, if you don't know him, you aren't going to make it. The first week in June, I'm going home to New Guinea again. I'm trying to finish the translation of the New Testament in another language. I worked in 7 languages out there. I tell you, that's the most valuable possession you have.
But you ought not to have it just in here. You ought to have it here and in your heart. My Bible was taken away from me, but that didn't make any difference because as a little girl, God laid it on my heart. I had memorized volumes of Scripture, whole books of the Bible. How much of it is in your heart? And so I say to you tonight, young people, if he ever lays his hand on you, don't be afraid of it. I never walk alone, for he is with me. I have spent months alone up in the jungle of New Guinea with my people. I've never in 42 years known what it was to be homesick. I love those people. So when I go home, would you remember that out there are still areas where nobody has ever gone with the gospel message of Jesus Christ? We stood on the mountain behind our house and looked out at fires and smokes from other villages where no one has ever gone.
I look at young people like you, and I often think, God, if someday you just call to me and say, come on home, I wonder who's going to step into my place out there. Do you have a life to give for your Lord? He gave everything for you. I heard him call, come follow, and that was all. My gold grew dim. I rose and followed him. Wouldn't you follow if you heard him call? I don't count the cost anymore. I still say to my Lord, at night when I lie down, precious Lord, I'd still go anywhere for you. The compensations are so tremendous.
Thank you for watching this video. Feel free to like this video and subscribe to this channel, to stay up to date with new videos as they come online.